Hey yo, welcome to the third episode of the Architect's Purpose podcast. I think y'all are going to enjoy this discussion quite a bit. It is all about Chicago in 1893, the White City. The book is The Devil in the White City, but we are pretty more focusing on the architecture versus the serial killer. That's another podcast, but this episode is all about the head honcho, the man who gets it done, Daniel Burnham. This guy pulls off a Herculean effort, and essentially an entire city is built over 660 acres, and an entire World's Fair from ground up. It's basically built on a marsh. This guy pulled it off, and this discussion really leads into the nature of what it means to be an architectural firm, as well as the important dynamics between the different roles in a firm itself. But the discussion also leads to the emerging and changing technologies of the time, as well as calling other key characters like Olmstead and Prout and others. So, without further ado, enjoy. Today is all about really a turning point in the technology of society, and it is all about the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and it was really made possible by obviously a lot of people, but notably Daniel Burnham and a, a few notable others of Olmstead, Brute, and I'm blanking on a fourth one. But one thing that really stuck out to me was the scale of it, of and pretty overall size of the fair. I mean, it's over 600 acres and over 27 million people went through it. So that is quite the hefty undertaking. And plus, the site they chose, they basically had to do a full Dubai and build it all up because there really wasn't quite much there. So, what were a few of the questions that you posed to the class?
So one of the first questions I asked them was the who was the famous landscape architect that helped craft the World's Fair, and most of them got it right,
I would hope
thankfully.
so.
And then I asked him, well, what else was he known for? And many of them got that right too. Of course, Central Park. But I also asked him, well, what did he do in Massachusetts? And he crafted what was known as the emerald the emerald necklace, which was a series of parks in Massachusetts that created an ambiance, not to the scale of Central Park, of course, but certainly it was a notable project for him at the time. I also asked him questions like, well, what was the so Olmstead really wanted something to happen out on the lakes. What was the most important thing about that? And it was of course, the creation of these electric boats to float back and forth across the lake. And it took them a really long time to actually find somebody who would build those. But so his idea was, I don't want to plant flowers. I don't want to, create a garden. I want to create an entire environment. And I think that without Olmstead, and this is one of the things that we forget about architects, without Olmstead, the Chicago Fair would have been a disaster.
Oh,
Um, his vision for the lake, the wooded island, even though they allowed the Japanese to build a temple there that was, an affront to him originally, but he ended up accepting it. But his vision of crafting an entire environment that wasn't about planting flowers or even specific trees. It was really creating an experience.
mm,
And we talk about that a lot today. The experiential architecture, and you see that in retail. You see that, certainly in sports facilities, even in the one that was recently completed in Southern California, the SoFi, um, arena. It's all about the experience of attending an event like that, and the spaces that you go through, and the environment that's created for that. So we talked a lot about those kinds of things, and those were some of the original questions that I asked.
oh yeah, and it's really quite an amazing achievement that they were able to pull off. I find it really perfect that you honed in on Olmstead, and that truly, without him, and I would argue as much as it was his talent and his design, but also through the entire process, I felt he was the one who was most like Roark to that vision where Burnham, as things got crunching, he's like, man, we need something up. Like, it doesn't really matter what it is, it can't be unfinished. And it's also quite interesting how um, this story is kind of the classic story of an architect, and that he was he was late to finish his project, but it turned out pretty good. So like because it was really interesting to learn how half of it, most of it, wasn't even open or quite done for the first month or two of it open, and it still drew people, but it took up until the very ever first Ferris wheel, and that to me also, remember reading the actual uh, stats on it, as in, so the Texas Ferris wheel at the Texas State Fair is pretty damn big. It's like 216 feet tall. The first one was 246 feet tall and had upwards of 36 cars and could hold at one time 2,000 people.
So I asked them the question of, um, you know, have you ever been to the Texas State Fair? Obviously, it's here in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
And how many people can fit in one of those cars? And I think it's probably 8 people.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about a Pullman car. Does anybody know what a Pullman car is? And people's like, I don't know what that is. And I said, it's a fucking railroad car. I mean, that is a Pullman car. And so what Ferris designed was that each car that went up on the Ferris wheel was a literal train car, um, that could hold up to 100 people in it at any one time. And that's pretty phenomenal. I mean, just the engineering feat alone at the turn of the 19th century is pretty phenomenal.
Exactly, because and
And he had a challenge. So he challenged the Society of Engineers, saying, come on, guys. I mean, we're Americans. We can do this. We can build something more impressive than the Eiffel Tower. And all of the um, offerings. There were some really ludicrous offerings to try to compete with the Eiffel Tower. Some of them 2 and 3 times the height and size of the Eiffel Tower. And Burnham astutely said, "It's just not going to get built." And then
No.
all of a sudden, Ferris came through with his wheel, and it truly was an ingenious artifact. Certainly for that time, and really for all. I mean, can you imagine building that today? I mean, if you built it today, it would still be an engineering feat, and that was 150 years ago. I mean, my gosh,
Exactly.
that's amazing. So one of the things that we moved quickly to, so Burnham and Root, we talked a lot about the arrangement of an architectural practice,
Mm-hmm.
and we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that there are 4 basic classifications within an architectural practice. And just to belabor the obvious for a moment, obviously design is a
Mm-hmm.
key component, project management is a key component, business development is a key component, and then the technical prowess to execute the design is another component. And those are really the 4 central elements for any architectural practice. So Burnham and Root, they shared some of that because Burnham actually had a little bit of panache himself, and so
Yeah.
he was able to, sell a client and sign a deal, even though he wasn't necessarily thought of ever as the lead design person. Um, but and so, um, which is a little bit atypical. The designer at Root was really the technical innovator, right? So he
Engineer.
created the platform, basically the floating slab in Chicago for all of the horrible soils that they have in Chicago. He
Mm-hmm.
created a, a way in which they could build high rises by building, a really deep, thick concrete slab that basically floated on the really bad soils in Chicago to raise uh, buildings to amazing heights. And he was the first one to do that. So typically, you don't necessarily find a designer and a technical person within the same individual. But what Burnham brought was the business development side and the project management side, the practical. And so they created in Burnham and Root the ideal practice because they had all 4 of those areas easily covered.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked a lot about that, about, in today's practice, it usually needs at least 4 different individuals who are focusing on those elements, because the talent for one specific area um, rarely lies in beyond that one particular focus. Um, I feel like as a design director, I feel like I'm a pretty creative guy. I feel like I am a really good technical architect, but I also rely on other people to be much more down in the weeds than I am in order to execute the designs. And so, again, we spent a lot of time talking about that in our class about the, the arrangement of an architectural practice. In the same way that, Sullivan and Adler um, also had, those skill sets, and the fact that when Root died, Burnham was still able to move forward with his practice. And Sullivan and Adler, when Adler left, Sullivan was not able to maintain his practice. And so, what were the fallacies there? So we spent a bit of time talking about that.
It seems they are all 4 components that do work in tandem, but if you don't have the ends of it, as in the client acquisition side and the completion side in the project management, then it doesn't matter how great the work is, it can't be built because you don't have those things. And it's partly why we see a lot of uh, average stuff out there, because people can schmooze and can run a construction project, but when we're speaking about design or something that is way more subjective and beyond concrete numbers and a bottom line, it is quite crucial to have that element as long as you have the other two.
So
Because
successful practice, in my opinion, has to run efficiently on all four of those cylinders. And if it doesn't, then you're going to have a failure in one part. I mean, you can have great design, but if you don't have the technical capability, your roofs leak, you get sued, you go out of business. If you don't have the ability to go out and seek work and have a business development acumen and be charming and all of those kinds of things, then you're not going to bring in even new work. And again, I think that Sullivan was so irascible as an individual that he turned away any potential client that would actually come to him, even though he was a brilliant designer, an incredible innovator. I mean, he built one of our first skyscrapers ever in the city of Chicago, but yet he wasn't able to maintain a practice, and so he was coming to Burnham later in life, selling artwork to him in order to just keep food on the table. I mean, that's that's a horrible way for an architect to go. So we spent a lot of time talking about, and I said, well, what's the name of this course? It's the Architect in Contemporary Society. And, we're trying to analyze, within the realm of what happened with the Devil in the White City, what happened to those practices then, and how does it apply to the practices of today? And is there any, relevance to that? And of course there is. And so we had some really nice discussion about that.
yeah, and it seems also that in how we talked last time of how Brunelleschi was that first real emergence of an architect, Burnham and not him specifically, but this era and especially this event really pushed it more and solidified it along with all of the uh, true technological change, and how it was quite interesting how the way they signed it then influenced how we built our cities, obviously in a very American bastardized way, So it, like, we didn't quite get the white city everywhere. One thing that bothered me kind of the first time learning about the expo and how they designed it, I was all confused. Or I mean, I understand partly why to design it in a neoclassical nature, but it's it seems as I've learned more, there was much more of a blend of exposing the new steel structure versus just hiding it all. But I mean, I understand why they gave people what they kind of know and could potentially expect or have at least heard of. But with the World's Fair being a show of new technology, they showed a Greek city, you know, all in all.
Well, at the time, Corbusier and Gropius and others had not even arrived on the scene yet. So the notion of the most advanced architecture theory at the moment was the Beaux-Arts theory,
Mm-hmm.
the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so, creating an environment through neoclassical forms was, it wasn't necessarily an issue of being familiar with that. It was the only way people knew how to do architecture at that moment.
Okay.
And even Sullivan hated neoclassicism, obviously, and his structure, pushed the envelope to reduce ornament and the the classical orders of the columns and so on. Um, he he still subjugated himself to the agreement of the whole group. Um, one of the questions that we asked was one of the questions I asked my students was, of course, how did Burnham feel about his entry exams to Harvard and Yale? How did that go? And of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
didn't go very well.
Nope,
He
did not get in.
and he froze. He froze. I mean, he froze on the entrance exams and wasn't admitted to those institutions, and that had been a chip on the shoulder his entire career. And so we did this in two classes. And so the first class we were talking about that, and I said, well, I think Burnham will find that he was certainly um, he found a way to um, get over that, because in the end he he received accolades from these other institutions that we'll talk about later. um, but at first he felt like when he was reaching out to the New York architects, who were so much more accomplished and created all of these amazing structures all over the East Coast, he
Hmm.
found that he felt a little bit intimidated by them, right?
Yeah.
Um, and he didn't necessarily need to feel intimidated, but because they were well educated at these higher institutions that he held a lot of respect for, I think he felt like he was a second class citizen. And what I was trying to explain to the students was that it's really the body of work that you produce over the course of your life that demonstrates who you are as an architect. And it doesn't matter whether you go to Harvard or Yale or Columbia or um, Cornell or what. You don't have to go to the Ivies to be able to produce a body of work that is worth people having respect for, because ultimately um, you know Burnham had his day. And
Exactly.
and and I feel like he was um, you know ultimately I can't find the right word for it, but um, he um, he received the accolades that he wanted his entire life when he received his honorary degrees from both Harvard and Yale. And of course, he went to Harvard instead of Yale to receive his honorary degree.
Exactly. Um, and that is quite along the parallel of ProArch as well, in that they weren't quite approved by the common standard pair for kind of different reasons. But also, in reading the book, I found, or really felt he was a lot more like Keating, in
Yes,
that he
we
was,
talked a lot about that.
yeah, like I couldn't get that sense more of, please like me, please approve, please. I mean, a part of me does obviously think he enjoys what he did. I mean, he wouldn't have lived in the shanty, for the years he did, without that enjoyment. But that chip on his shoulder was quite emblematic of Chicago and their need for that approval of others at times, especially obviously New York. And to Keating, it was burning in my ears.
Yeah, so Yeah, I love the fact that some of these books build on each other, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about The Odd Couple. Who's Keating and who's Rourke.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we compare Johnson um, to Frank Lloyd Wright, but the issue with Keating was that he was seeking people's approval for their approval's sake. Burnham was never in that position just to seek people's approval for approval's sake. He wasn't out there to say, "I'm sorry, do you really like this? I'll design something that you really like." And that was, Keating's approach was to appeal to the masses in a way for him to receive um, self affirmation for what he was trying to do. Burnham wasn't necessarily trying to do that. He was really trying to put together a coalition of architects to produce something that eclipsed the Paris World Fair, and 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 he wasn't trying to placate to the masses. He wasn't trying to do something to seek other people's approval in the sense that if I design it this way, will you approve it? Will you like it? He wasn't going out and asking people's opinions about the work that he was doing in order for him to feel better about himself. And that was really what Keating was trying to do. He
Mm.
didn't have um, an internal compass to produce the kind of work that was important to him. And Burnham did. We talk about, one of the things that Burnham did in his work was he produced uh, uh, what's known as the Burnham window, which is um, it's a projected volume from the surface of the facade that has a 45, a 90, and a 45. So it's basically a bay window that pushes itself out from the facade, and that is known as the Burnham window. Um, and he produced as part of what I saw that in Philadelphia. I saw that in New York. I saw that in Boston. Um, you know, it's a way of designing a building differently than certainly what was done before him. So he produced something that was really unique and still exists even today um, as an artifact of architectural design.
Mm. He was quite transcendent in a lot of different aspects. I actually didn't even discover him until I studied about him in school. But in learning about really all he did, he combined a lot of different aspects of Keating and Proarch, but also Philip Johnson and others, of really understanding his own ego enough to bring in other talented people. I think that really set him apart and not all that fearful to go meet with four of the best living architects that are in New York, not Chicago. And he just gets so much flack, but he's like, hey, do you want this to be the best or do you want this go? And I do feel, though, it being built in a neoclassical style, it was heavily placating to the passes. I do understand the argument that we quite don't have um the text style to push neoclassical aside, but the methods of which they were building were not classical and were barely even neoclassical because they, especially the ones out of steel, it's not like they're using gigantic load bearing stones cut for columns or anything, so it's like it's always bothered me that they did that. But then when you look at the true scale of the buildings, they truly dwarf the people. Like it's truly astonishing both how tall they are, but because they are neoclassical and they are done with pretty rigorous proportions. And as we discussed, I believe in the first episode of, well, if you're gonna build something in a style, let's do it right. And
And they absolutely did it right.
exactly,
And the issue there, so to me, the most impressive thing was that he kept, you know, 4 or 5 world class architects on task. And he immediately decided that the designs that originally required, brick and stone, he said, listen, we're never going to get there. We're never going to get these built. And so we're going to have to build them out of plaster. And, which obviously is the creation of the White City.
mm-hmm.
Um, and that was the only way to get it done. And so, it was Burnham who really had the foresight as a project manager to say, we've got a deadline to meet. This is what we need to do. And even though all of the architects said we would prefer for it to be out of brick and stone, he said we're not going to do that. We're going to do it this other way.
Yeah,
And again, when we talk about the framework of an architectural practice, you need somebody to be able to kind of control the schedule and to say, we've got to be realistic about this, guys. I mean, we only have 18 months to do this, and there's
yeah,
no way we can get there. And so that's, again, one of the things that I appreciate about Burnham was the fact that he realistically understood what the issues were, what the schedule was, and how to get from here to there. And even though everything wasn't 100% ready at opening day, and it was probably only 40% on, what was it, consecration day or whatever they called that, dedication day. Um, on opening day, that everything still wasn't in place, but it was in place enough for people to be overwhelmed,
mm,
um, and, and so you really have to appreciate Burnham's sense of schedule, project management, and a drive to achieve a goal that was really difficult under those circumstances.
oh yeah, yeah.
Is it
Because
getting too dark? I mean, I know you can't see me that well.
I can see you, um, decently, but soon, yeah, it'll be pretty dark. Would you be able to move inside or
Yeah, I
not?
can move inside if I need to.
Alright, cool. Uh,
It'll cut into my cigar smoking, but
yeah, we are all uh good right now, and I should be able to fix it some in post as well. But one thing that was quite impressive was that scale. I mean, nothing like this had been done by the people who had done it, and it was 50% larger than the Paris Expo, which just blew everyone away. Obviously, the Eiffel Tower, and it was quite outstanding that they pulled it off in such scale, but also that sort of sprawl nature, or I mean, it's interesting that in the beginnings and advent of the skyscrapers, they didn't really build anything like they were, but also on the other hand, they only had a short period of time, so you can't exactly um, build a an entire city like Manhattan. It takes centuries.
yeah, but you have to realize that the people of Paris hated the Eiffel Tower when it was first built.
Mm,
They they railed against it, and they thought it was an anathema to the culture and class of that entire city. Um, and now it's celebrated as, if you go to Paris, you've got to go see the Eiffel Tower, right? Um, and so it's interesting that some things that were a bane to the parishioner, the people of Paris, have now become one of their most beloved monuments.
ex uh, exactly. And I kind of wish that they would have kept the White City more intact, but also all of the architects explained how they really bemoaned the idea of it going in to into obscurity and it really being a shanty town essentially. But it was still quite an outstanding achievement in how they built over 600 acres in a very short time. But also on top of it, this was such a technological turning point from Tesla and Edison and all of these different really brand new technologies happening. And I mean, the place was lit at at night and consumed more energy than all of Chicago. I mean, it was an absolute feat of technological prowess, and it's like the dichotomy of it looking like an idealized Greece is absolutely mind blowing, and I'm finding it a lot more fascinating than hating on it because hating on
No,
it's easy.
I mean, we have alternating current because of Tesla, um, and the fact that he proved um, that he could do that and provide all of these lights, which is one of the reason. The other reason why it was called the White City was because of all of the lights, not only because of the plaster that you could see during the day, but how much it was lit, and that you could do it at a city scale. You could light a city at a city scale through alternating current. And I know that Edison was really pissed about that, but because
Well, I mean,
he didn't
it
get
came.
his lamps, approved.
So, and it all came down to the cost. I'm forgetting the raw numbers, but Westinghouse came in at like a third of the bid, and it was. I mean, you can't not choose that. It's a
Right.
third, and this is an insane project with government funding and government oversight. It was quite interesting to see that relationship of project manager and the powers that be, because his clients, it is the world, but it's also the government, because they're putting the bill, and at a certain point in time they need more funding, and then that triggers an audit, and then they're asking why to spend so much on nails, and it's like there's a lot to build, and it's just an added layer to the role of an architect, and a quite crucial one.
Yeah. And that's absolutely right. So, when they brought in that reclamation committee of three to look over every expenditure that Burnham had, we talked a lot about that. Is like, how, as you as an architect, if you have somebody coming in and looking over your shoulder at every expenditure that you have, how would you feel about that? And I'm sure Burnham was not not pleased that he had to answer to somebody after the committee had named him, basically the czar of the exhibition. But now he had to answer to this committee of three over, as you said, every nail that was put into place and every expenditure that they had. I'm sure it really irked him, but he soldiered on. I mean, he kept moving forward with it, and he didn't let them dissuade him from the ultimate goal of having this accomplished. And ultimately, they let the committee go. That small committee of three. I compared them in class to the two grumpy old men on the Muppets who were bitching about this and bitching about that, which they were, and ultimately they saw that it was not necessary because Burnham had it under control. And
Yeah.
that, again, is a huge testament to his ability to, um, manage the design and the construction part of something that was so overwhelming from a monetary and size point of view, but his management skills enabled them to prevail. He just stuck to it and said, you know what, this is what our ultimate goal is. We're going to keep moving forward on it.
And a part of that is continually pestering late and procrastinating designers, because that is quite a theme throughout the story. I mean, at a certain point, even Olmstead is complaining, and poor poor old Olmstead. I mean, he's falling apart. His teeth hurt. Always had, just always in bad shape. And I found it kind of funny also that like a month before it opens, he takes like a sabbatical to England, and like to get inspiration, maybe. But I'm like, bro, it's a little late.
Yeah.
I feel like go back and plant some stuff yourself. And the largest crime is I feel he didn't even quite get to do what he really wanted to accomplish, because for one, Olmstead, it took not months, not years, but decades to achieve the appropriate like and picture qualities, because all of his parks are not formal, squared off flower hedge and flower beds and hedges. It's way more of that naturalistic landscape akin to England. And you can't achieve a forest overnight. And on top of it, during all of the construction, it was quite terrible how they would just trample all over his lawns and everything they built. Or it's Chicago, and they want to open in May, and they think they can do all the planting over the winter. But it's Chicago, and there's 2 feet of ice because the site they pick's basically a marsh. So like he is behind so many 8 balls, and is able to stick to that original vision, and on so many different counts, from the quotes, but especially the overall design. Like he was completely unwavering of doing anything tacky, and basically anything also the French do, because the French are very formal. Their gardens are homages to men's oppression over nature.
Right. Whereas the English gardens, are more naturalistic. I mean, the Italian gardens are the same way.
Mm-hmm.
The Italian gardens are a little bit of it's a mix between French and English, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, the fact that again the outdoor spaces and the environment that was created was just as important as the um, is the central um, what was it, the Hall of Palaces, or I forget what that was.
The Court of Honor.
Court of Honor. Yeah, so the Court of Honor was a magnificent space.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so one of the things that I encouraged the students to do was that well, so you read this book, did you look up any images for what the Court of Honor looked like? And a number of them did not. And I said,
Really?
guys, I mean, you really need to, as we're reading these things, you really need to do a Google search on this stuff because there's some amazing images out there that I think you're missing out on, and it's truly impressive what was built from an architectural artifact point of view, but also from again an environmental point of view from Olmsted's position. And when we talk to about the issues of today, and with COVID and social distancing and the importance of outdoor environments, that is becoming more and more significant. And I mean, I can't tell you how. I mean, I've lectured on this a number of different places and a number of different times, that the spaces in between the buildings, and
Mm,
it's almost an anathema as an architect to say this, but the spaces in between the buildings are almost more important than the buildings themselves.
de-
Um, and but from a Frank Lloyd Wright point of view, the two have to really work in harmony with one another. The spaces in between the buildings need to work in harmony with the buildings themselves, and I think they really achieve that in the White City.
exactly. And the overall congruence of the design as well. I mean, it's almost designed with the trigger um, of 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 Houseman's Paris, and that all of the corner sides and all of the uh, proportions are to be quite strict, but also what was what was quite amazing about these spaces is what happens inside is all of these really incredible exhibits, from exotics around the world to new technologies. But what really made it thrive was that outdoor public space, the ability to gaze upon itself and truly look uh, truly look across it as a more naturalist landscape than here's a street. And it was quite interesting also that so the typical fair or what have you, you can basically enter from all sides. That's the point. Draw people in forever, but both Burnham and Olmstead were quite adamant about no, we should actually only have one, maybe two entrances, but the point of the design is that experiential nature and walking through it, and it just happens differently through a different sequence of spaces. And they were so adamant about people entering through the court of honor. So in all of the descriptions or critiques, it would explain, hey, this is the main entrance. And even Burnham whenever smoozing others, because God, how much of his time was with delegates from other countries all over the globe, just to schmooze them, and let, let alone truly accomplish what they are trying to to achieve.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why the World's Fair has dropped off the map.
It's sad.
Um, we talked a little bit about Mises Barcelona Pavilion as being a part of the World's Fair in Barcelona, and that was a contribution that was clearly obviously ahead of its time, and this wonderful monument. I've been to a couple of times now, and it's just an amazing space, an amazing pavilion to experience. Um, and I don't know why the World's Fair has fallen out of favor with governments, but clearly the expenditure to do that, and certainly had an effect on that.
It seems as well as technology evolved and travel became more ubiquitous, and especially the transference of communication, and as that became a lot more rapid, you didn't have to hold an annual or a planned event to release these essentially press releases. I mean, the World's Fair is a gigantic press release, and it was quite something how both in time they have this event and then all of the technologies to really back it up to make the exhibitions really as worthwhile as the buildings themselves were. Um, so something I've been thinking about a little recently, and it was spawned for sure from reading the Devil in the White City, that what's the true virtue of an exhibition and having these buildings go away, and to add to the tour and having it end in a very poetic nature, or because I find it a lot more valuable if the building's still here.
Well, I think so. I mean, if you go to, Barcelona as an example. If you go to Barcelona as an example, they still have a number of the warehouses, and they even have two towers that are, mimic images of the Campanile and Piazza San Marco, flank kind of the entry to it. I think some of those remnants, still remain with us and are still important. It is a shame that the White City was built as such a temporary thing that it couldn't remain with us for much longer. But we do have other examples of it, even in New York, where if you even think of the Men in Black movie, the spherical objects that are just outside of the Met Stadium.
Yeah.
They had a World's Fair exhibition there in the early 1920s or 1930s that were again suggesting of the technological advances of art and architecture at that point. And those are artifacts and remnants that still remain with us. So we do have some examples of those things that we can still refer to, but it's a shame that the beauty of the White City is really just captured in photographs and renderings now.
Yeah. Uh, it seems also that if they knew that the Parisians were going to keep the Eiffel Tower, I think they would have tried to make it more of a long-term solution, and especially if it was done today, I would highly suspect that the idea of reuse would be in mind, and so today, like, what's kind of the equivalent? I would say it's probably what the Olympics, and how a city has to rapidly build up if they don't already have the proper infrastructure. And one thing, whenever I was studying abroad in Austria, they had like a few junior and a winter Olympics, a few events actually in Innsbruck. They built all of the Olympic housing, and then afterwards that turned into a portable housing for citizens, and it was designed with that intent in mind, instead of, okay, let's just dismantle this whole thing. And I would put that more on the times than any of them being terrible intentional polluters or something, like.
No, I think you're right. I think the Olympics is the closest thing to the World's Fair that we have today. I mean, they bring in, the world class architects from, everywhere to contribute to the beautification of a city. So you look at Zaha's, um, her, um, what is it, the ski jump. Um,
Yeah.
Element in Innsbruck. You look at the birdcage uh, in Beijing and other places. So, each city becomes the recipient of, these beautiful architectural artifacts that still, in most cases, remain. I mean, even the Olympic pool in Munich is, this incredible thing where, that's where Mark Spitz, won his 12 gold medals. And when I was a student, I was able to, when we all went to Munich, I said, okay, I was a swimmer in college. And so I'm like, I'm definitely swimming in this pool. And so, I got my swimsuit on and my cap and all that and I swam that pool
No.
as a moment in my life. And I remember that very distinctly.
How cool. Just waiting in the waters of Olympic champions, and especially that feat there, which at the time and still Pau is just absolutely outstanding. I mean, it's one of the unobtainable or thought to be one of the most difficult things you can do.
Yeah. And that particular pool, they designed it with tensile fabric structures over it, which was truly unique at that moment. Nobody had ever done anything like that. um, and so, yeah, well, I think the Olympics provide us with these wonderful architectural artifacts in the same way that the World's Fair did for us, a century and a half ago.
And I think that hopefully we are slowly learning that the solution is to build something up that will last beyond the events, because how many of these structures or places are true ghost towns after it's over, when that was a real chance to maybe try and design an ideal city or something, at least aiming towards that. Instead, they build all of these ridiculously huge structures, which can be cool and icons, but what's that use after? I mean, the Eiffel Tower itself, I mean, France has always been on the map, but the Eiffel Tower, it became that tourist spot of, okay, let's go there and see it. And it is just an outstandingly sculpted city as well, that it is a draw.
It is.
And to have that opportunity to do that in forever, and then miss that, and then you only get revenue from the Olympics, which hopefully you made money, but it's billions and billions invested, and then there's um in that corruption as well, which is its own thing. But it is quite that chance, and it'll be interesting going forward if we're ever going to have Olympics again, or what that'll actually look like, and if we can hopefully build some longer lasting structures, because I feel that a lot of times when a client needs a building, they're either just thinking about their business or flipping it, or a lot more short term than that building will actually be there. The contractor is only worried about having it built.
Right.
So it has to fall on the architect to truly question and stand there as the pinnacle of design and longevity and pre-use, because it's not in the client's best interest. It's not in the contractors. It's in the cities and societies from an architect standpoint, and which is why I think it's so crucial to be a lot more like Olmstead and ProArch. But Burnham showed if you have one hell of a follow through, that'll get you pretty far, because he was truly able to somehow bring this entire, I mean, like, he hadn't ever done anything of that scale. So, like,
Yeah.
how could he even quite know what to expect? Or, I mean, it was absolutely fascinating to me to hear about how many workers on site they would have, and especially towards the end, they were working 24 hours, So, and at some points, over 20,000 workers at once. I mean, I don't know the average size of, say, a crew for a high rise, but it's not 20,000 people.
Well, that's
And
an individual building versus a whole city, whole development.
over 600 acres, which still just blows me away. I was able to find, I'm pretty sure they're the authentic pictures, because of filed one official photographer, and then they charged for the Kodaks, which that was its own and a personal camera.
Well, what I told the students is that there's a book called that was printed by the Princeton Architectural Press called "The Plan of Chicago," and it's all about the White City, and
Yeah,
they can get their hands on it. I have a copy of it in my library, but if they can get their hands on a copy of it,
yeah, yeah.
they should cherish that.
Yeah. Actually, I have it too. Right here. Hanlon gave it to me a few Christmases ago. Um, it is quite the book. Uh, yeah, just like sitting here. And it is really that attention to detail, and imagine being these authors and scholars and priests and researchers. You are going through old people's letters and all of, like, any sort of correspondence they ever had that is hopefully available, and that only gives you part of the picture. Thankfully, a lot of those have been saved, but I'm thinking, so in future generations looking back on ours, assuming they still have access to the same internet servers, they're going to have to rifle through so much spam, and just like, I don't know how much of an individual type of of research would help more of a meta type. Um, but it's quite interesting, especially in the Temple and the White 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 City, that all of these correspondence are actually in the book, and you actually are reading the words from Burnham to his wife or to other characters and understanding his sense of urgency and flattery and on and on. And I just was blown away by that level of detail, and that I truly felt I was in the book or in the story line versus it being some sort of reports on
Yeah, it
the
was an amazing book that encapsulated all of those issues, and you felt like you were building it along with Burnham, and you had that sense of urgency, you had that sense of you felt overwhelmed at times, and the thing that I appreciate about that book is his ability to rise to a Herculean task and accomplish it under insurmountable odds against him, and yet he still prevailed.
Mhm.
And that really led to the success that he had as a practice afterwards. That even though it was a tragic loss of John Root being dying at the very beginning of the designs for this, he was still able to prevail. And yeah, it's a book that you know leaves your mouth agape. Um, you're in awe and in wonder of uh, the effort that it really truly took to pull this thing off, and he did it. And so he deserves every accolade, every the honorary master's degrees that he had from Yale and Harvard. They probably should have given a doctorate in that.
Yeah,
Just he accomplished what nobody thought could be accomplished on a time frame that was almost impossible, but yet he still was able to prevail. And so what does that teach us about architectural practice? That it teaches us to be very vigilant about our focus and our purpose, and if we are and if we do that, we can accomplish things that other people think are impossible.
because throughout the entire story, it's not exactly as if he's set up for failure, but a lot of people are expecting and they don't really want it at all because up until this point, Chicago is still trying to put itself on the map. It was thriving commercially, but compared to the bourgeois and the arts of New York, it was still um, quite secondary, and it was still viewed as as rural instead of a dense and hyperactive city like Manhattan.
Right.
Um, and they were really able to push through and achieve. And I mean, it's this event definitely sets off generations of some high self-esteem for people from Chicago. Like, and um, it's also the emergence of a lot of different social issues as well, from unions to marketing, in that really up until now, anytime they had a strike, the owners would just bring in other people, and they would just get the job done as much as they could. And this was really a turning point, especially on this scale, in the realm of thousands of workers striking and then receiving certain things, as in a minimum wage or a um 40-hour work week. And these sorts of societal changes really set up the entire 20th century of sorting out these relationships between employer employee.
Well, and the fact that they built it during a huge recession. I mean, there was rampant unemployment at the time, and yes, it was benefited by the World's Fair in Chicago, but at the end of it, all those people who were let go, went back to essentially the Black City.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I mean, labor unions, labor disputes, all of these issues, came about. I mean, they came to the forefront during the World Expo, and again, I think Burnham definitely handled it in a way that very few people could, and they were able to still pull it off. So yeah, I mean, it's I mean, you may not respect Burnham's architecture because he still did essentially neoclassical work for the rest of his life, even though he had somebody like Sullivan to help lead him to doing something, more modern, more different, um, uh, thinking about architecture in a very different way. Um, you have to respect what he did, what he accomplished, and certainly in the time frame that he did it.
No doubt, he was an outstanding force of nature, and
So
it's
what I was
yeah.
telling my students is that you don't have to be the lead designer to be an outstanding architect, and I think that part of what we teach our students in school is that the best designer is the best architect, and that's not necessarily the case. And again, that's why we spent so much time talking about these four different categories within an architectural practice. That it really takes, at least two individuals and sometimes four individuals to be able to craft out all four of those major roles within a practice for it to be successful. um, and you can find your own way. If you're not the lead designer in your studio, that's fine. That doesn't mean you're going to be any less of an architect. And Burnham was not the lead designer. I mean, he did not have the talent to do the stuff that John Root did, but he did have the talent to pull something off like this, and that brought him accolades that we almost remember Daniel Burnham in a stronger way than we do John Root.
Oh, for sure. And I'm curious if that would be the same if he remains alive, because it was interesting as well to learn that in the firm of Burnham and Root, Root was the one who was thought of a lot higher than Burnham was,
Right.
especially because, especially at that time, that structural prowess truly amazed people. I mean, almost anyone could schmooze or whatever, which isn't exactly true, but I'd say different skill set than um bringing something new to the world that they hadn't ever actually seen or experienced before in their collective memory.
Right.
And and maybe like the emergence of Burnham almost required shedding of broods, and that it also allowed him to have a lot more responsibility as well. But the role he had in the fair was different than the role he had in the firm. I mean, it was similar, but in the fair, it was a lot more, I think, hands off on the explicit design. I mean, each building had like almost a like teams on it, and it was all still late. And it was way more of that facilitator, and that skill is still a very difficult one to achieve and get it right without any past experience. And it seems that in paralleling this to Brunelleschi, it seems from the 1400s to the 18, we see this diversification and specialization more so than one person being in charge of every single aspect that's happening. And you kind of do that in project management, but before that wasn't quite possible with Brunelleschi to only be a project manager, where with the increasing complexities.
Well, that was true of the
No,
Enlightenment period. It was that, we went to a more specialization in different aspects of the building arts. We went to a more specialization in theater, in literature, in art, in architecture, um, and that was certainly a byproduct of the Enlightenment period. It was almost more Aristotelian, in the sense that Aristotle, you know, Plato was, the true philosopher and thinker, but Aristotle was the, you can't dismiss his philosophy, but he was all about the classification and organization of elements. Um, you know, it was the yin and the yang between Aristotle and Plato that, propelled Western civilization, that reemerged during the Enlightenment, where the the individual of the Brunelleschi didn't necessarily exist anymore. Architecture became more of a team sport, and it is still consistent today. Even though you have, individual, you know, geniuses that come about and create new architecture, and certainly we saw that with the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. Um, it's you have individuals that help propel architecture forward, but the fact that the Enlightenment period disseminated some of those roles into a broader group of people, still prevails today.
and also it's quite interesting how it's coming out of those dark ages, and it's that true rebirth and trying to at first recapture the old, but then as technology progresses, they sort of blend the two, and then modernism sort of just takes over until it just ends. Like it, I also don't think um, I also don't think that modernism got quite its fair shake, but that is for sure a conversation for a next time.
Yeah.
But this project and this book is such a great read, and it's truly something like the dome that it's it it something like this didn't thought happen before at this scale, and it probably won't happen again.
You're right.
And, and that's something.
So it's very much like Brunelleschi's dome. It's something that, again, it's an era that you look at with a sense of awe, because it happened once. It probably won't repeat itself, and it happened under circumstances like the dome that were, everything was fighting against its completion. Everything was fighting against its ability to really see it to fruition. And yes, it did take the genius of somebody like Brunelleschi to execute it in a way, from both a design and the ability to put something together. I mean, he's known more for his machines than he is actually for his design. In the same way that Burnham is known for his ability to pull together, all these disparate um, individuals and in a task in a way that was truly unique for his time. So yes, I think there's a really strong corollary between Burnham's ability to manage something that was um, this difficult, and Brunelleschi's ability to also manage a task that was thought to be impossible. Certainly before they started to build it.
and the contrast in like obviously Brunelleschi did not literally build the entire thing himself, so he had some help, but it was a lot more of the workman type help than the designer and engineer type help that Burnham absolutely demanded, because like it would be unreasonable for him to design the whole thing, and like it just there isn't enough time, you know. So the and at, it was really the first and one of the only times I can think of, especially in the states, that we've had an experiment like that and truly put that investment in there, of that scale, because everything else, like all of the other building that we do, is on such a more minor scale and relative to its area, you know, because like this was 660 acres. There aren't many developments that big, you know.
No, they're
That's
not.
that's quite big. um and when they are, it's sprawlburbia,
Right.
and that just I it hits me more and more just how I'm almost stuck on the word arbitrary, but I don't think that's quite right, because obviously we have built stuff for a reason, but just how um not even random, but how subject to change everything is, and how everything we do have was just kind of made up by people like you and me. I mean, yeah, there are these generational brilliant minds, but they aren't the ones building all of our cities.
Right.
It's
Right.
people like us, you know, who are really out there in the field. And how can we truly make that impact? Because, like, hey, oh, I'm doing a small library or what have you. How can that be the best thing possible?
Well,
And
the idea there is that you don't just think about your particular site, but you think about it in, you know, if you take a, 1 square mile in every direction for what you're building, what is the impact of what you're building? Um, and we can talk a lot about this later on, but it's the idea of building an infill building versus an object building. Um, and certainly what Burnham did in, I would say, and you would argue that in creating a city, he was building an infill type. He was creating an environment, and when you build an infill building, you're contributing to the city. When you build an object building, it is something that should be admired from afar, but it doesn't necessarily contribute to the fabric of the city itself. And as architects and urban designers, I think we should always strive to contribute to the urban fabric in some way, in a positive way. And so I would encourage anybody who's designing any building to take a site plan of a square mile in every direction and see what the impact of your individual building is going to have to that square mile, and are you contributing to the fabric of the city that you're building, in which you're building.
yeah, yeah, because it wasn't until I was a couple of years into school that we really started to hone in on that context and just how crucial that is. Because if you're building a certain church or any certain program, is it adjacent to anything that conflicts with it, or the exact same thing, or what's the overall composition of that area, and as broad as it can be, like, are there pedestrians, are there not, what's the traffic, on and on and on. And all of these sorts of dynamics to the site really be into.
And I'm not advocating contextualism by any means. I'm just what I'm advocating. So I don't think that we should build something to look like something else that's next to something else. But
Well,
I
no.
think you should take into account your contribution to the environment at a much larger scale than just the site itself.
Yeah. I'm speaking more from a functional standpoint than aesthetic. And it was interesting to me when you were talking about Burnham building these infill buildings, and I saw them as objects, but in the way of describing them as you did, all it's way more about their relationship to each other, because a lot of these buildings are freaking huge, like their entire blocks, but they operate at such a scale that steps down to the human, and also it works in relation to others, instead of it being something in a sea of a parking lot,
Right.
which that's way more of an object. And that ability to create the all of the plaza spaces and all of the outdoor pedestrian space that's created by the buildings and by the landscaping, and that's truly what people inhabit. And it's that push pull of space objects, and how can an object really create space in a spatial manner versus in object manner in a formal manner. And it's achieved a lot of the times formally, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but I am coming to the end of my talking points.
Okay.
Um, and I'm just trying to propel this into the next discussion, which is all about the transition from that more neoclassical, ornamental, into that very clean, machine-like modernism, and how Frank Lloyd Wright really straddles both, and those conflicts are quite um, outstanding, and how he is able to just continue to be himself through the faces of um, scandal or um,
Well, he reinvented himself in a way, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the Odd Couple.
mhm,
Philip Johnson reinvented himself, throughout his entire career, but so did Frank Lloyd Wright. But
mhm,
um, as Johnson's reputation perhaps recedes, Frank Lloyd Wright's reputation excels because he held to a series of principles his entire life, even though his early and middle and the end of his career could have easily been created by three different architects. He still held fast to his ultimate goals and his ultimate principles. Um, and we can talk a lot more about that in our next session.
and it seems a heavy theme of these discussions is that self-awareness and that honesty to what you do enjoy and excel at. And obviously things are going to be quite difficult, because life throws everything at you, and plus developing a craft is difficult. Like, you're gonna screw up so many times, and if you can at least be honest enough with yourself to not be so damn hard on ourselves, that I think we can achieve a place of self propelling, instead of needing others to comment or like or approve of whatever we are doing, because all these other people are just as twisted and broken as you are. So why are and most of us don't even like those other people. So like, why are we even asking for this admiration from people we wouldn't even probably talk to, or it just blows my mind. But then I flip it back on myself of like, oh, I do that a lot, and trying to mitigate that need for approval of others. And it's for sure a balance, because people are going to say positive and negative things all the time, and it's how you roll with that instead of letting that be the cutting force. Some pretty important advice I heard was the praise has to be as quiet as the negativity,
Right.
because either way leads to madness. I mean, you can end up like Keating and just doing whatever it says to do in the papers and what anyone tells you or whatever, and then the papers all of a sudden don't like you and you don't know what happens. And
Right.
it's that whole problem of feedback, and it just escalates to a point that you're again not resonating at your own level and trying to be almost in the perception of ourselves, in trying to think what the other person thinks that we are, which is just like insanity. That's
Great.
and a large theme that all of these characters and architects really deploy is that rigorous self-awareness and self-esteem, and I'm not sure where that comes from beyond experiencing a lot of different things. Like obviously upbringing and personality have like an influence, but I feel that that exposure to trial and that exposure to things that you also enjoy and can thrive upon, that's the if that's not the meaning to life, I don't know what is, because that just seems such in our nature.
Yeah, I agree.
But I always enjoy these talks.
I do too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And um,
I'm hoping it's not too dark for you to be able to use this.
no. It should be pretty good, and I can fix some of it in post. But the point of it's the audio. I mean, like the video's more of an added-on thing, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I love you. Thanks for the talk. It's been great. We'll see you later.
Yeah. See ya.
All right. Bye.